Imagine the sky turning gray at noon. Not cloudy, gray, like the sun itself has been switched off. The air smells like sulfur. Ash is falling instead of rain, settling on everything, on the grass, on the water, on your skin. And it doesn't stop. Not for days, not for weeks. Somewhere, thousands of miles away, a volcano just changed the entire world, and you have no idea why the sky won't clear. This actually happened, more than once. And for the humans living through it, it might be the single closest our species ever came to disappearing entirely. About 74,000 years ago, a volcano called Toba on the island of Sumatra erupted with a force almost impossible to picture. It's the largest volcanic eruption of the last 2.5 million years. Toba didn't just erupt, it ejected an estimated 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, that's enough to bury an area the size of the United States, more than a foot deep in ash. The eruption column reportedly punched more than 30 miles into the sky. And the ash wasn't the only beginning. Toba pumped enormous quantities of sulfur dioxide into the upper atmosphere, where it turned into a fine haze of sulfate particles that spread around the entire planet. That haze did something specific and devastating. It reflected sunlight back into space before it could reach the ground, which means for years afterward, less energy from the sun was reaching Earth's surface at all. Some researchers estimate global temperatures dropped by as much as 3 to 5 degrees Celsius in the years following the eruption, and in some regions, the cooling might have been even sharper. This might not sound catastrophic on paper, but a shift like that, sustained for years, is enough to shorten growing seasons, kill off vegetation that took generations to establish, and disrupt weather patterns across entire continents. This is what scientists call a volcanic winter. Not a single bad season, a prolonged, global cooling event triggered by one eruption. Now, picture what that actually meant if you were a human being alive at the time. You didn't know what a volcano was, not in any scientific sense. You definitely didn't know when it erupted on the other side of the world. All you knew was that the sky had changed. Food had become harder to find, and it wasn't getting better. This is where things get genuinely debated among scientists, and it's worth being honest about that. For a while, a popular theory called the Toba Catastrophe hypothesis suggested that this eruption nearly wiped out our whole species, based on genetic evidence showing surprisingly low diversity among modern humans, as if our whole population had passed through an extremely narrow bottleneck around that time. Some researchers propose that human numbers may have dropped to as few as a few thousand breeding individuals. More recent evidence has complicated that picture. Archaeological sites in places like South Africa show continuous human occupation right through the Toba eruption, with no obvious collapse in the archaeological record, which suggests that while Toba was almost certainly a severe environmental shock, humans in at least some regions weathered it without being pushed to the edge of extinction. The full truth is probably somewhere in between. A genuinely brutal, multi-year crisis in many parts of the world, survived by populations that were already remarkably resourceful. So, what did surviving something like that actually require? The first thing was diet flexibility. Populations that survived the harshest effects weren't necessarily the ones relying on any single food source. Coastal groups in southern Africa during this general period show strong evidence of exploiting shellfish and marine resources, food sources that don't disappear the way land vegetation does when sunlight drops and growing seasons collapse. When the usual land-based food supply falters, having an entirely different category of food to fall back on isn't a bonus. It's the difference between surviving and not. The second was shelter and fire, at a level of consistency beyond what daily life normally demanded. A volcanic winter isn't cold for one bad night. It's cold, dim, and hostile for years. That kind of sustained environmental pressure means fire has to become something closer to constant infrastructure than an occasional tool. And shelters have to hold up against not just one storm, but season after season of degraded conditions. The third, and maybe the most important, was the same thing that's come up again and again throughout human history whenever things get genuinely desperate. Groups. Isolated individuals facing years of reduced food and disrupted weather don't have good odds. Groups that could pool knowledge about which coastal areas still had food, which inland areas had failed, where water was still reliable, had a real advantage. Information moving between people wasn't a convenience during a crisis like this. It was survival infrastructure. There's something almost humbling about this story, honestly. An eruption on one island, thousands of miles from most of the humans alive at the time, was powerful enough to dim the sun for years and reshape the climate of the entire planet. And our ancestors, who had no idea what caused it, no way to predict when it would end, and no way to know if it was even survivable, made it through anyway. Not through some single brilliant innovation, but through the same basic toolkit that shows up in nearly every serious ancient crisis. Flexible food sources, reliable fire and shelter, and people willing to share what they knew. Because in a world gone gray and cold for reasons nobody understood, that shared knowledge was the only thing anyone actually had control over.